Now available in paperback and e-readers, Isis Legacy. The sorority secrets of the goddess next door are revealed in this all-new Isis series adventure. Get Isis Legacy in paperback and e-readers at online booksellers everywhere. Why is the writing in so many modern comics at big comic publishers so terrible these days? Well, the answer to that is due to the fact that editorial really does not know how to establish standards for publishing modern comic books. Now, the problems with modern comic books today date back about 30 to 35 years ago. Now, 30 to 35 years ago, many comic creators were upset about Jim Shooter being in charge at Marvel Comics, and because your Jim Shooter established very high standards and was very hard on comic creators, many comic creators didn't really like Jim Shooter's editorial style over at Marvel Comics. And because they did not like Jim Shooter's editorial style at Marvel Comics, many decided to go in a different direction after he was let go from Marvel Comics, going for a bit more of a softer approach. Now, across the streets over at DC Comics, you had Jeanette Kahn and Paul Levitz in charge, and they also established a high standard for quality. However, they were a bit more tactful in their approach, but the impact of Shooter on the industry led to a lot of editors going soft on creators, and this going soft on creators had a detrimental impact on the craft of many comic book writers and many comic book artists, because without a strong editor in charge to maintain a high standard for the books being published and a consistent standard for all of the books being produced, a lot of creators learned a lot of bad habits as they worked on developing their craft for comics. So in the 90s, we had a lot of creators coming out, and without an editor there to give them guidance, a lot of these creators just went their own way, similar to the way your Jim Lee, Rob Liefeld, and Todd McFarlane went when they formed Image Comics. And when Jim Lee, Rob Liefeld, and Todd McFarlane formed Image Comics, there really wasn't much of a standard over there as related to storytelling, and this further encouraged more creators to go out here and participate in bad habits as related to the craft of storytelling, because they saw the huge sales that your Jim Lee, Rob Liefeld, and Todd McFarlane getting on books like Spawn, Wildcats, and Youngblood. And yes, many of those books were quite entertaining, but a lot of the writers who came in that era really learned a lot of bad habits that impeded their skills as related to storytelling. Now, back in the 80s over at Marvel under Jim Shooter, or at DC under Jeanette Kahn and Paul Levitz, there were strict standards as related to storytelling, and a writer really had to spend a lot of time learning how to develop their craft, learning how to work within the models as related to the house style of Marvel Comics or the house style of DC Comics. And as you sat there and learned about things as related to the house style, and you learned how to work a story in a 3-act paradigm, you develop your skills and your craft as a storyteller. And as a writer developed their skills and their craft as a storyteller, they worked on things like 1-page stories or 4 or 8-page stories, and these were usually published in little segments like Marvel Age, or in the back of a comic like a Captain America in the 17:5 format or the 16:8 format. And the whole point of these smaller stories featuring smaller characters was to develop a writer's skills so that when they got a full feature comic, they were able to handle developing a story under the house style over at Marvel or DC Comics. But in the 90s, editorial wound up going in a different direction, and instead of developing a writer's craft over time on backstories or smaller tier books like an Alpha Flight or limited series like a Damage Control where Dwayne McDuffie cut his teeth, What we saw were a lot of inexperienced writers given full titles, and because these writers were given full titles without developing their craft, that's when a lot of writers went out here and put out stories that were not of the highest quality. And a lot of these writers, because those books were selling very well, what happened was a lot of these writers started to develop bad habits as related to storytelling, and a lot of artists started developing bad habits as related to going out here and composition of figures and developing scenes and imagery. And those bad habits became practically considered to be normal during the extreme 1990s, where an artist could get away with misproportioned bodies and writers could get away with extremely convoluted and ridiculous plots. Now, after the crash of 1995 at Marvel, we started to see the impact of bad editorial, because editorial, after Jim Shooter left, there was Tom DeFalco, and then after Tom DeFalco, they then decided to split editorial into multiple different divisions, where they had one editor working on the X-Men titles, another one working on what they called the Marvel Heroes, another one working on Spider-Man, and another one working on the Hulk family. And what really came out of that bad editorial teamwork was a lot of inconsistent and very sloppy books from 1994 to about 1996, and this led to a sales decline. Unfortunately, as the sales declined, what happened was the creative people who worked at Marvel, they wound up learning more bad habits, and these bad habits have really continued to further impact the industry long term, because as a writer learns how to go out here and develop stories and they don't get any correction from editorial, they start believing they can go out here and write any sort of story and come up with any sort of ending. And that's why we have writers today who, whenever they paint themselves into a corner, all they do is either kill off a whole lot of characters, develop some sort of gimmick where they go out here and give a character a new costume or some sort of marketing stunt. And this is all because many of the writers did not learn how to develop their craft, and because they did not learn how to develop their craft in an organic fashion, they don't know how to go out here and write a story with an organic beginning, an organic middle, and an organic end, where we see the hero go on a journey to overcoming the obstacles and defeating the villain. The reason why we don't see this kind of story these days is because those writers learned all of those bad habits, and they learned how to use gimmicks like new costumes, gimmicks like time travel, gimmicks like a death. These are the skills that they learned, and because there was no editorial to rein in the crazy and let a creator know that a character has to maintain a level of standards, this is why the standards at companies like Marvel and DC have declined, and why the writing at both companies is so shoddy these days, because these writers from the Generation X era who came into comics, they did not get any sort of guidance or training from editorial as related to the craft of storytelling, like people like the late great Dwayne McDuffie received, because the late great Dwayne McDuffie, he went through Marvel's internship program, he received a lot of training, and he wound up working on many smaller titles before he got Damage Control, the miniseries, and then went on to do other books at Marvel before moving over to DC and founding Milestone in the 90s. Your Dwayne McDuffie got his training and cut his teeth over at Marvel, honed his skills as a craftsperson, and then went on to go over to DC and then further create the Milestone universe, but he would not have been the great writer that he was had he not gotten that training over at Marvel under Jim Shooter. Now again, a lot of creators had a hate for Jim Shooter, but under Shooter, Marvel's standards were very high as related to creativity, and all of the books that came out of Marvel Comics in the 80s were extremely consistent in terms of story, extremely consistent in terms of action, and many of the characters' actions were extremely consistent from book to book and writer to writer, and that was all due to the leadership of editorial at the time. Now we fast forward to today with today's comic editorial, and today's comic editors oftentimes give passes to creators who practically can do whatever they want, not understanding how their decisions in their stories can impact a character and can do serious damage to a brand. And many of these creators, they're just in their feelings about their writing, not understanding that yes, you can feel that way, but the whole thing is your bad habits and your bad ideas can do severe damage to a character and do severe damage to a character's brand. And that's why an editor is very important in helping a writer to develop their craft, because a good editor, he will point out many of the holes and the flaws in a story to prevent a writer from making a mistake that would wind up alienating fans, the same way the storyline The Crossing alienated so many Marvel superheroes fans who liked characters like Iron Man and the Avengers, or right now what's going on with your Christopher Cantwell, who has practically destroyed the entire character of Iron Man, who is one of the flagship characters of the MCU. The reason why Iron Man never really took off as a character in the comics and got the sales, even though the movie was a blockbuster and Iron Man was a flagship character for the MCU, was due to editorial not being able to guide its writers. And right now the Iron Man character, even though the character's been rebooted and has a fantastic armor design by Alex Ross, is suffering because your Christopher Cantwell doesn't set a good direction, and that is all due to editorial not giving him any sort of guidance. And that is the impact that a editor has on a writer. If an editor is too soft on a writer, the books will not come out consistent, the books will not come out as quality, and what will happen is that these writers learn a lot of bad habits, and those bad habits, they become the norms as related to comic storytelling. And that's why a lot of comics today are just really poorly written, and that's why a lot of stories never really have that impact or emotional resonance, because these writers, they have nobody there to be the eyes and the ears of the public to let these creators know that this idea is extremely stupid, or this idea just isn't going to work with this character, and it's not going to be consistent with the brand that you're trying to build for that character. So a lot of today's comic writers, whether they be millennial or Gen X, the big problem is there was nobody there in editorial to give them that guidance, and because they didn't get that guidance on how to write these kind of characters, or to keep them consistent with their stories, or to even show them, hey, you need to go check this back issue and do some research. This is why many of these characters really have not connected with readers who are new, and why many old veteran readers like myself become alienated from these books, because there was nobody there to teach that craft of comic writing. And it is a craft, and I know this from working on my own scripts. It is a craft, and you have to learn how to work within that craft and develop your skills, because if you don't develop your skills, you wind up making a lot of critical mistakes as related to storytelling, and you make a lot of critical mistakes as related to simple things like transitioning from panel to panel, and you make a lot of critical mistakes as moving scenes forward. If you don't have a good editor there to guide you and let you know, okay, this sequence is going, it has some nice action on this page, but the whole thing is this scene is not, we're not able to follow the scene into the next panel, or that this dialogue really, it doesn't work. I need you to read this aloud to see how this sounds. There are things that a good editor does to help a writer. And those writers today, they don't really get that guidance because people today, they get really emotional about their writing, not understanding that it's not personal, it's business. And in the commercial business of comics, you want to make sure that your product is the highest quality because you only get one chance to make a first impression on a reader. And if a reader sees a story that is off when they go pick up the comic, they're going to put the comic back on the shelf, or in today's day of social media, they're going to go to their social media platform and roast up your book. So many of these writers today, they don't understand how this publishing business works, and that's because we don't really have a lot of publishing people in it anymore. And because there's not a lot of publishing people in it anymore, this is why the craft has fallen completely off. And many people don't know what they're doing. They don't know what mistakes they're doing. And that's why comics are not as good as they used to be back in the 1980s and the early 1990s. Now, if you want to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. And if you want to pick up my first comic, Esteem No Good Deed, you can find it on Amazon's Kindle for 99 cents. And I have an upcoming comic, John Haynes at Death's Door, getting ready to come to Kickstarter soon. And until then, you can pick up many of the books on the SJS Direct universe on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find those books on Smashwords, the iBookstore, and Google Play. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and e-readers, Isis, Revenge of the Cyber Goddess. The goddess next door takes on the threat of a deadly digital diva driven to destroy the world in this action-packed, all-new Isis series adventure. Get Isis, Revenge of the Cyber Goddess featuring a bonus pin-up and the other 2 books in the Cyber Goddess saga at online booksellers everywhere today.